CSWS.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here in this lovely evening. And I have the pleasure, actually it's an honor, to be introducing Dr. Brice Harper. There was a colleague who was supposed to be doing that, but she got ill, and I will pass on the honor to introduce this remarkable writer. Dr. Brice Harper is a scholar, activist, author, editor, and social scientist. These roles may seem disparate at first glance, but as you get to know Dr. Harper's work this evening through her talk, you will learn that her labors are united. In all these roles, she works for social justice. She writes about food justice, animal rights, ethics, critical race theory, gender, class and sexuality, and their intersections. Dr. Harper received her BA from Dartmouth College, her master's from Harvard University, and her PhD from the University of California at Davis. She is editor of Sistah Vegan, Black Female Vegans Speak on Food, Identity, Health, and Society, an anthology that examines how race and gender shape the vegan experience in the US. Sistah Vegan includes poetry and essays, including a wide variety of fascinating stories about individual conversions to vegetarianism and veganism for reasons rooted in health, spirituality, and politics. Dr. Harper is the author of the novel Scars, a Black Lesbian Experience in Rural White New England, published in 2014. Scars is the compelling story of the social and inner lives of 18-year-old Savannah Sells and her friends and family as they collaborate in the intersectional relational work of healing. Dr. Harper is currently working on her third book, which focuses on the intersections of ethical consumption, alternative Black masculinity, and hip-hop. You can read more about that exciting project and other things she has in the works on her blog, the Sistah Vegan Project. That is sistahvegan.com. Her talk this evening is titled Scars of Suffering and Healing, a Black feminist vegan perspective on writing, race, and neoliberal whiteness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harper.
Good evening. Thank you for welcoming me to your campus this evening. We're here. I traveled with an 18-month-old in tow, and she decided to have a stomach virus, of course, as soon as we got on the plane on Wednesday, because why not? But it worked out, and I nursed her back to health, and she's now outside with what's her name? Circe, yeah. A lovely 18-year-old was playing with her, so things were good, so I'm good. Mama's happy. So thank you very much, and I'm excited to start off with I guess this is kind of a book tour for Scars, and I started writing it in 1996, and I decided it was done in 2008. I could have probably written it 12 more years, but my friend told me, I think you're just done, because you just, it's never that you're ended with writing. It's always rewriting and rewriting. So I started Scars in 1996. It started off as kind of a side project to my Dartmouth thesis. And I was looking at how it kind of sucks to be queer and a woman of color at Dartmouth. And I didn't like the situation in the early 90s, and I decided I wanted to write about it. So I wrote a social science-based thesis about that. And I'm also a novel writer, and I thought it would be nice to actually translate this critical theory into novel form, because a lot of people are open to new ideas through not necessarily critical theory, but the novel or songs or some type of creative art. So that's how Scars started. And I'll get back to that later in my talk. But currently, I'm also a research fellow at Food First in Oakland. And I'm working on the Dismantling Racism in the Food System initiative. So we just started that in April. Hiring me half-time to really tackle what systemic racism is doing to many systems, including the food system. So a lot of my work is focused not just on racism, but as I've been working more or less, I realize a lot of the problem is not really naming whiteness or white supremacy. So I'm more prone to looking more at this through the title of Dismantling Neoliberal Whiteness in the Food System. So I'll actually be talking more about what I mean when I say neoliberal whiteness in my talk tonight. So I actually started the Sistah Vegan Project about 10 years ago. And my goal was to show how the embodied experiences of Black women in terms of race and class and gender will create a unique, something unique when it comes to why they came to veganism. So I put that together, and I have an interesting story where when I did the call for papers, I posted it on the internet, and it ended up on many sites, but one of the sites it ended up on was vegan porn, which has nothing to do with porn and everything to do with veganism. And I was attacked for basically playing the race card, people saying, what does race and gender have to do with veganism? Veganism is only about animal rights. And it wasn't directly toward me because the moderator had posted the call for papers, but it ended up being 80 pages long of self-identified white vegans basically bashing this idea that race matters even in veganism and animal rights. And also focusing on my use of the word Sistah, bashing Black English, using phrases like, if you can't speak proper English, you don't need to be given a job. And most of them didn't even consider themselves racist, but they were engaging in what I would consider covert whiteness. And instead of getting, just having a reactive response to it, which I used to do when I was a child, and then someone would call me the N-word, I decided I'm going to take a different approach. And I went to my thesis advisor before I'd even figured out what I wanted to do with my master's program and what I wanted to write about. And I kept on coming back to what was happening on this blog. And at the time, I was supposed to be a Java developer. And then at the same time, I'm trying to figure out why am I the only Black person in my Harvard graduate classes doing programming. And then eventually my advisor said, I think your thesis has to be what's happening on this vegan site. And what I did was I discursively analyzed what was happening in the conversations, and I produced a thesis that it was a new form of critical race literacy to understand what whiteness looks like at the covert level. So a lot of studies had already been done by white supremacists who are Nazis, KKK members. We all know they exist, we all know what it looks like. But what does it look like when you actually a person who's identified, like a self-identified white person who's like, I'm not a racist? What does it look like? Even though you think you're not a racist, but you're engaging in this particular behavior that actually has very racialized and racist consequences. So I ended up looking at that space. What does it look like if you want to be a person who's interested in veganism and you identify as Black and you go into that space and you hear these white vegans talking very badly about Black culture? What does that look like when you're trying to use veganism as a tool to heal and understand social justice? And I ended up getting the Dean's Award for writing that thesis work, and it really opened up this new dimension to me really understanding once again, there's people who practice veganism, identify as white, they say it's cruelty-free, but at the same time, they don't want to engage in white privilege, they don't want to engage in actually being an anti-racist activist. So I just wanted to give you that background of where I'm coming from. And then during that same, a few years later, I edited and had the Sistah Vegan Anthology published because I wanted to bring in more voices of Black women and really ask them, are we really post-racial, or does race have, was that a significant contributor to how and why you entered your vegan practice? And it was for everyone, for all the women who contributed. So, what is it that Breeze Harper does? My scholarship undertakes analyzing the complexities of systemic racism through the methodology of critical race materialism and within the disciplines of critical studies of food and social fiction. So what is critical race materialism? So critical race materialism is influenced by critical race theory. Critical race materialism asserts that formal imperialism and legalized racism were replaced with racial neoliberalism at the end of the 20th century. Critical race materialism argues that racism was not eradicated, but in fact reconfigured in a way that fits the material and political investments of the global north, mostly white population. This arrangement is called coloniality, and mainstream ethical consumption rhetoric is not exempt from this arrangement. And ethical consumption can be veganism, vegetarianism, eating local animals. And I'm specifically really looking at veganism. And I've named this arrangement as being part of neoliberal whiteness, which I'll go into in a few slides. So, for 8 years now, I've used this medium of anthology and novel writing to really dig into how racial hierarchies of power operate and are maintained within the USA and beyond. Now, what better way to explore these timely issues than through the material culture of food and food objects? And in the USA, in which ethical consumption objects are becoming more and more popular, what do these objects mean in terms of understanding race, whiteness, and systemic change in the USA? So my central questions for not just this talk, but overall with the current work that I'm doing are, what can food objects, such as vegan food, recipe books, cooking appliances, beverages, tell us about concepts of ethical consumption and their connections to the lived experience of race, such as anti-racism, racial privilege, colorism, normative whiteness? What is neoliberal whiteness, and how are ethical consumption philosophies affected by it? So for those of you who may not know, ethical consumption, I mean, there's been volumes written about it, but I'll try to condense it into a paragraph so you know what I mean when I refer to this concept of ethical consumption. It's a way to consume within a capitalist economy that is ethical. Now, there's not really a concrete definition, but the ethical consumption movement has risen out of the wealthier nations for consumers to take accountability of how their consumers' practices can create less injustice and environmental damage. From making sure coffee is fair trade, to buying eggs that are from cage-free chickens, to buying food made from solar-powered companies, ethical consumers believe that capitalism and consumption can create a just world if done ethically. So, why food studies? In the Western Academy, the first food studies scholars were anthropologists who looked at exotic foods of non-white cultures in order to explain the cultural patterns of quote-unquote primitive peoples. Cultural food studies as a formal field of study was not established until the 1960s. Much of the analysis within cultural food studies is undergirded by the notion that tastes are not objective, but rather are social constructions which are culturally formed. Food reflects power structures and social formations. Levi-Strauss explained that when one prepares food, they are in fact communicating a cultural identity, which is repeated and solidified through repetition of culinary traditions. Such cultural standards are significantly influenced by middle to upper class value systems and the meanings they give to culinary items. So I actually employ this concept of semiology in my work with cultural race materialism and food studies. Semiology is the study of signs and seeks to understand how signs communicate the value system of a culture. For example, how are vegan food objects symbolized to create myths about innate purity, cruelty-free, and ethical? How are the signs of food ethics perceived, and how can such interrogations reveal how phenomena such as racism, neoliberalism, and globalized capitalism are normalized or rejected? Roland Barthes' scholarship on semiology has been used extensively in food studies as well as critical whiteness studies to analyze how modern objects convey a situation, how they reflect a system of communication, and most importantly, how the meanings inscribed on these objects literally shape the collective consciousness of modern Western society. The social places that certain foods have in society are also a display of a particular type of attitude. For example, in my fiction and nonfiction writing, I have explored differing attitudes that people have towards sugar, cocoa, PETA-approved vegan food objects, animal food products, fast food objects such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola. For example, food justice groups such as food empowerment project in California, signify chocolate sweets with slavery and exploitation, while groups like PETA market big corporate vegan cocoa products as cruelty-free, simply because a non-human animal wasn't harmed, regardless if it came from an enslaved child laborer. Though Barthes is known for his work on semiotics of objects, his scholarship not only focuses on the object of food, but also on the objects of post-empire whiteness. In the mid-20th century, Barthes analyzed the effects of post-empire whiteness on the collective consciousness of white people living in the global north. His observations led him to believe that despite colonialism having been formally abolished, most white people would continue to function in the world through the logic and grammar of post-empire whiteness, which could be revealed through analysis of their relationship with and to everyday objects. And I put this concept of neoliberal whiteness as a form of post-empire whiteness within this continuum of how whiteness operates. So what am I talking about when I'm using this term neoliberal whiteness? And why critical studies of whiteness? So whiteness is the conscious or unconscious promotion and advancement of the beliefs, practices, values, and ideals of Euro-American white culture, especially when those cultural values are represented as normal. Whiteness as a contemporary value system is formed by heteronormativity, neoliberalism, ableism, Christianity, consumer capitalism, cissexism, patriarchy, and middle-upper-class sensibilities. And for people who are not familiar with cissexism, it's assuming that everybody is cisgender identified, that when you're born with a vagina, then you identify as a woman in the heteronormative sense. So people who are genderqueer, gender nonconforming, or transgender identified, they are excluded from even this concept of whiteness, even if you're a white person that does not identify with a gender conforming identity. Does that make sense? So whiteness isn't just about phenotypes, blonde hair and white or light skin. That's been part of it, but also these ideologies along the lines of what's the proper class, the proper way to present your body, the proper way to even eat certain food objects. So within this concept of neoliberal whiteness, there's this belief that the real racists are Nazis or KKK members, and overall racism is not an impediment to the opportunities and equalities for people who are not white. And those people who usually believe that are white-identified people. It's very rare you'll meet at least most people of color born and raised in America that actually think we're in a post-racial era. I'm just giving you all this background because I'm going to read a lot from my book, Scars, and you kind of need to know where I'm coming from and how I translate a lot of the social science work into fiction. And then when I read those excerpts, so you're not completely lost. It's important for me to give you this context. So back to Barthes. Barthes' work has also inspired me not to only look at post-empire objects of neoliberal whiteness, but also analyze how the same vegan food objects take on contrasting and similar meanings that they do. So, although the purpose of Barthesian racial analysis was to solely reveal how white collusion with whiteness can be revealed through the relationship to everyday objects, I wanted to complicate Barthes' conclusion not just in my own dissertation work, but also in my social fiction novel, Scars. So by applying this framework not only to neoliberal food objects, I open up new possibilities to think about how collusion with neoliberal whiteness is not necessarily limited to predominantly white liberals engaged in ethical foodways, such as white-dominated organizations like PETA. I like to explore how even the descendants of the colonized can unconsciously uphold particular values of whiteness when advocating for liberation from it, but with a very different set of consequences that are very racialized. So for example, there are a lot of people of color who live in low-income neighborhoods. They may buy products that come out of exploited racialized labor force. But at the same time, they don't have many choices or opportunities to buy different, more healthier food objects. So they're buying into this because they live in environmental racist space. But at the same time, particular corporations bank on using racialized labor force to get things like cocoa and sugar. So as a person of color, you're kind of trapped in that. Even though you may not necessarily agree with it, you don't necessarily have the options that a white middle class person may have to go local and grow your own food because you have access to land. So that's how I'm exploring that. Like, what does it look like where you have this concept of neoliberal whiteness internalized as a person of color, yet you're still trying to fight against systemic racism. And what does that look like as a consumer, as a privileged consumer? Even if you are the working poor, you're in the global north where you still are a privileged consumer. What does that look like? So my analysis of food objects such as sugar, dairy, and cocoa, later explored through my reading of Scars, is not really about animal rights or even veganism. What my analysis will suggest is that mainstream framing of what are civilized and cruelty-free is linked to a larger American cultural phenomenon. Beneficiaries of a neoliberal capitalist economy do not really want to know from where and how commodities get to them. A process of estrangement erases the genealogy of how these objects arrived there and how they took on their harmless meaning that they have. Hence, estrangement teaches the holder of such objects that what they have in their hands is pure and innocent, that they have no responsibility to investigate any further how it got there in the first place. Such ideologies fool the subscriber of neoliberal whiteness into thinking they have an active consciousness, when in fact this estrangement encourages passivity in consciousness. I think we can see this in representations of mainstream vegan food and health culture through vegan food objects, as well as the human bodies that symbolize ethical vegans, most notably PETA. And I'll get to that in a few slides. I'll show what PETA and the mainstream vegan rhetoric look in terms of what an ethical body looks like. For my dissertation work, I analyzed how PETA promoted cruelty-free vegan objects that were actually made possible through economies of neoliberal whiteness and poverty, such as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which makes products like tomatoes available all year round through the exploitation of indigenous women in Mexico at incredibly horrible working conditions. However, this isn't surprising if one understands the logic of post-racial mainstream vegan culture that PETA is part of. The lack of consciousness or care around being actively against systemic racism and white supremacy can be explored through Scars, and the consciousness and actions of one of my characters, Eric Roberts. So first, let me briefly explain what the dominant themes are in vegan mainstream culture and with dominant vegan and animal rights groups such as PETA. So vegan food and healthy eating, these are the themes that I discovered over the 10 years I've been doing this work. It's post-racial. The vegan mainstream is post-racial, apparently. So race is no longer a significant impediment to creating equality, happiness, health, etc. As a matter of fact, bringing up race in any form means you're actually racist. So I've been accused of being racist when I want to apply critical race theory to exploring veganism and animal rights. And yes, the accusers were white. There's the assumption that those who practice veganism and want to consume vegan products are white, young, able-bodied, upper middle class, heteronormative, and thin-bodied. And that this is the benchmark of healthy, moral, and green living. Veganism should only be about animal compassion, and then second, maybe individual health. But it's usually just a single focus, a single issue focus. Silence are the realities of people of color that cannot be post-racial, as well as how being low income affects the ease of going vegan and engaging in other mainstream ethical consumption practices. And neoliberalism really drives the rhetoric of the mainstream vegan movement, which people believe, the mainstream, change can only really come through individual consumer power versus making structural change. And like, Barnes talks about post-empower whiteness, but I don't think he really foresaw what neoliberalism would do. So this is why I'm really focused on neoliberalism and the concept of, free markets as long as it's ethical and, voting with your dollars. Like that has been really fused into this new notion of whiteness, of normative whiteness. And I find that problematic that they believe that all you need to do is buy vegan products to create a healthy body. Because actually left out of this are issues such as racialized state violence, food deserts, and poverty that prevent marginalized populations from getting to the point where they can have consumer power, privilege, and choice. So I see a lot of vote with your dollars, vote with your dollars. And the concept of voting is a very racial class privileged status. And if anyone is familiar with Michelle Alexandra's work, The New Jim Crow, an age of mass incarceration, and she talks about this concept of, when you incarcerate a huge percentage of the black and brown population, once you get out of jail, that doesn't matter. Like, you don't have rights to do things like voting and what that does. So the mere fact that a lot of white people don't have to worry so much about being part of that era of mass incarceration and losing their rights to vote, and then when you lose these other rights when you get out, it's hard for a felon to actually be hired, especially into a job that pays well enough, right? So it's just all of these things that limit your ability to vote with your dollars, whether it's voting for literally the food you want to eat or voting for a politician. So vegan mainstream rhetoric really does not understand the concept of voting with your dollars is not universal, but very entrenched in racial class privilege in the USA. So that's just like, I wanted to give everyone that context, and thank you for bearing with me through all of that. So now we're going to get to the good stuff, which is, now that you've got all that beautiful critical theory you had never asked for, I'm going to read excerpts from my new book, so you kind of have a sense of where I'm coming from. Let me just get a quick drink of water. So Scars. Scars is a novel about whiteness, racism, and breaking past the normative boundaries of heterosexuality as experienced through 18-year-old Savannah Penelope Sales. Savannah is a black girl born and raised in a white, working-class, rural New England town. She is in denial of her lesbian sexuality, harbors internalized racism about her body, and is ashamed of being poor and black. She lives with her ailing mother, whose emphysema is a symptom of a mysterious past of suffering and sacrifice that Savannah is not privy to. When Savannah takes her first trip to a major metropolitan city for 2 days, she never imagines how it will affect her return back home to her mother, or her capacity to not only love herself, but also those who she thought were her enemies. Scars is about the journey of friends and family who love Savannah and try to help her heal, all while they too battle their own wounds and scars of being part of multiple systems of oppression and power. Ultimately, Scars makes visible the psychological trauma and scarring that legacies of colonialism have caused to both the descendants of the colonized and the colonizer, and the potential for healing and reconciliation for everyone willing to embark on the journey. And I'll just explain 4 of the major characters. Davis Allen is one of Savannah's best friends, a straight white man who grew up on a rural dairy farm in Savannah's hometown. Davis and Savannah have been close friends since they were toddlers. Davis is the only white friend Savannah has ever chosen to develop a close relationship with. When Davis and Savannah interact with each other, the intimacies of their conversations reveal an interesting dynamic. Davis's perception of reality manifests from what Savannah has marked as a privileged point of entry: white, male, lower middle class, and straight. However, it is notable that Davis is deaf, so he does not have able-bodied privilege. Davis can never experience Savannah's embodied experience as a black lesbian. Growing up in a country that has institutionally legitimized whiteness and heterosexuality as normal, Davis's white and straight identity limits him to superficially interpreting Savannah's verbal hostility as nothing more than stereotypical angry black female banter. The second theme developed in Scars is the irreconcilable differences that Eric Roberts and Savannah endure in their rocky new platonic relationship. Eric and Savannah both identify as gay, lesbian. Eric identifies as gay, Savannah identifies as lesbian. However, that is where similarities between them end. Their frequent antagonistic verbal intercourses deconstruct the myth that being gay or lesbian means they will instantly connect emotionally to each other as comrades in the same battle against heterosexism. The exhaustive energy it takes for both to maintain their volatile relationship has its roots in Eric's oblivion to the fusion of his upper middle class status and his white male privilege when attempting to advise Savannah about being and coming out as black, poor, and rural lesbian. The third and more subtle theme developed in Scars centers on how Savannah's perception of oppression is positioned within a geopolitically global North perspective. Savannah never acknowledges her privileges as a USA national, only her lack of privileges as a non-white person. She considers herself revolutionary in thought in comparison to the people living in the provincial town she grew up in. Simultaneously, she has no awareness of her perpetuation of inequality outside of the USA. For example, Savannah is unaware of how many people of color outside of the USA are exploited so she can buy cheap coffee, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Esperanza Perez, a key character, is one of her best friends. Esperanza, a vegan and fair trade anti-globalization activist who originally grew up in Guatemala, visits Savannah from college. Through honest and heartfelt dialogues with Esperanza, Savannah's oblivious understanding of her geopolitical northern privilege is revealed. I hope to engage the reader and the audience to empathize with Savannah's realistic struggles with whiteness as the invisible norm in the USA, while also addressing the need for Savannah to engage deeper into the social injustice by encompassing and linking Black struggles in US racism to a broader range of social and ecological inequalities throughout the world, including the suffering and pain that go into commodities such as cocoa and the McDonald's pork sausage or chicken meals that come to Savannah's plate. My choice to title the book Scars reflects the legacy of Black anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon and his intense dedication to making visible the psychological trauma and scarring that colonialism, white supremacy, and racism have caused to both the colonized and the colonizer. My writing has also been heavily influenced by Octavia Butler and Angela Davis, not just in terms of Black critical thinking, but also critical thinking along the lines of how much suffering non-human animals endure due to the oblivion of complex characters such as Savannah Sales. During a 2012 February visit to University of California, Davis, Dr. Angela Davis brilliantly shared her views on state-sanctioned violence by looking at how people and non-human animals suffer. According to Dr. Davis's analysis, the dangers of how so many of our minds have been colonized by capitalism, to the point that we don't even think about how much suffering goes into a standard American chicken meal. By the way, Angela Davis is vegan. Let me share some excerpts from the book and then dive into analysis of how I'm using food and vegan objects in terms of understanding racial power dynamics. So the I character is the protagonist, Savannah Penelope Sales, whenever I say I. So, one second, I'm going to read from the book now, after I get a quick sip. So this is a scene, Savannah spent the night at Eric's apartment with several other friends after they had come back from a club, and she was too drunk to go home to her mother's apartment. And now they're at the table and they've prepared brunch for her. And this is her. Whenever you hear the internal monologue of someone, it's her. Sitting at Eric's kitchen table, I stare at my Belgian waffle, wondering where my dress is, wondering whether I puked on it, wondering if, after talking to Mama on the phone, she really doesn't need me back anytime soon. Enjoy your free time, baby. Don't you worry about me, she had told me. Enjoy my free time? I've begun to suspect that I don't know how to enjoy my free time. Had Eric been right? Do I really like being miserable? Oh, what does he know? Nothing, because he's never ever been poor. Why would anyone enjoy being miserable? Then her friend Davis interrupts her thought process. Savannah, you've been staring at that waffle for the last 5 minutes, Davis says to me. Without looking up, I shrug and reply. Lifting up my fork, I poke at it several times, sniff, and then put my fork back down. I don't enjoy being miserable. I slouch down into the brushed stainless steel dining chair. Who buys stainless steel chairs for a dining table anyway? My toes grace the warm hardwood flooring of the dining room. On the left of me is the entrance to Eric's kitchen. Ceiling trap lights brightly illuminate a newly renovated kitchen that is filled with high-end culinary purchases, like a Vitamix blender and Le Creuset cookware and bakeware. On the side of his enormous stainless steel refrigerator is a bookcase filled with vegetarian and vegan cookbooks. On top of the bookcase are photos of some way too happy and smiling blonde chick, probably his little sister, hanging on the ivory painted wall. I don't enjoy being miserable, jerk, I mumble, spontaneously grabbing one of my 2 knives on the side of my plate and then stab my waffle. All around my plate are too many utensils with various functions that I could care less about. They're all supposed to be for my brunch. Why do I need 2 different spoons anyway? What's the point of a small and a big fork? A red cloth napkin? Why? Why? Are you still drunk? Eric asked me. Taking the knife out of the waffle, I look up and pointed at him. I don't enjoy being miserable. What is she talking about? Esperanza asked. Who said anything about that? Eric asked. What did she say? Davis signs to Eric. She doesn't enjoy being miserable, Eric signs back. Well, I don't enjoy being miserable, I sign and say. Who said you did? Davis replies. The reject sitting over there, I say, pointing to Eric. Hey, this reject let you sleep in his bed while he slept on the floor, Eric replies. I mean, you hardly even know me. How can you make such an accusation? I continue. Taking a sip from his orange juice, Eric replies, it wasn't an accusation. I was merely speculating. You were beginning to get on my nerves. Sorry if I hurt your feelings, but it was just something I had to say. You didn't hurt my feelings. You just made me mad. My cheeks quiver a bit, but then I quickly command myself not to cry. I rub my cheeks furiously. Eric says, I always make you mad, Savannah. I thought you knew that by now. Now put the butter knife down before you hurt yourself, he says. Can I have your waffle if you're not going to eat it? Davis asks me. There's plenty of vegan ones left if you want some, Esperanza says, pointing to a plate of waffles with interesting texture and consistency. She intentionally emphasizes vegan. I pretend not to notice. How about I leave those all for you guys, Davis asks, not taking his eyes away from my waffle. Shrugging, I answer, go for it. He beams with joy and then pierces my waffle with his matte silver fork. We should play in the snow after, Eric signs and says. That sounds like fun, Davis replies, a mouthful of waffle in his pie hole. Can't you eat with your mouth closed without talking, you pig? I sign and say to Davis. Esperanza shakes her head and then shakes her right index finger at me. You know, it's not nice to insult a human being by calling them a pig. And pigs go through so much suffering just so you can get your breakfast bacon sandwich from McDonald's and then die from a heart attack. And then she interrupts Esperanza. Not now. Seriously, I just can't listen to this right now, I fume. Esperanza shakes her head and then whispers to herself, barely loud enough for me to hear. If not now, then when? She then gives a glance to Eric, gesturing with her raised eyebrows that she's looking for his support. He returns her glance with raised eyebrows as well, and then shrugs his shoulders. Yeah, probably not the best time, but I know what you mean. You know, just because you have a million annoying vegetarian and vegan cookbooks in your kitchen and wear that stupid peanut button all the time doesn't make you some perfectly enlightened human being. Gazillion vegetarian books, but I bet you don't own even one book about racism or white privilege, I say to Eric, as well as sign to Davis. My head begins to throb again. Why are we even having this stupid conversation about pigs? I don't really care to get into this. Anyway, savvy is just being savvy, Davis says and signs nonchalantly. Whatever, another time then, Eric repeats with a sigh. Esperanza crumples her eyebrows at me with disappointment. Well, what does she expect? I'm hungover and cranky, and she knows not to talk smack about my McDonald's. End quote. So my use of McDonald's in the novel is very intentional. And there's just a lot going on in that whole conversation, and I'll get to that in a moment. So there's this sense of these objects that convey class in a certain type of what I call white neoliberal civility. And not only is Savannah nervous around spaces of whiteness, she also feels very uncomfortable around spaces of middle to upper class sensibilities, food, whatever. And she's sitting there thinking about her apartment. And if you read earlier in the book, there's the apartment where she lives in. She's very poor, she has secondhand stuff. She doesn't, and then she enters Eric's apartment where everything is new. And, there's a Vitamix blender, which is $600. And Le Creuset bakeware and cookware. And she's also spent time with Eric in, spaces that she enjoys, which I'll talk about later, like McDonald's, where he's constantly commenting on, he can't believe she eats at McDonald's. He can't believe that she does that to her body. So it's interesting that she is not just comfortable around whiteness, but also, you know, the socioeconomic class, middle class to upper class, and what those food objects will represent to her. So what I was saying is that my use of McDonald's is very intentional throughout the book. And Savannah uses McDonald's as a space to deal with racism, internalized homophobia, and white privilege. And that space is very different from what Eric thinks is proper and ethical eating. Savannah refers to McDonald's as her fast food sanctuary. And it's obvious she doesn't like that Eric pokes fun at her choice to eat there. Is it because she's eating animals, or is it because McDonald's is where lower class people like herself eat, and that she should feel ashamed since higher class people like Eric wouldn't eat there? And I'm going to read a scene in which Savannah receives an offer to study in New York City from her community college professor. And she's at McDonald's looking through the materials with Eric, which she's convinced to come to, go to McDonald's with her. Quote, Eric steals a French fry from my carton. What else did it say? I want all the details, Eric says. Sitting at McDonald's, I'm trying to tell Eric the good news as he looks through the materials Professor Rogards has given me. Though Eric has issues with fast food restaurants, he drove me to my fast food sanctuary anyway. Less than 15 minutes ago, my future had been given a glimpse of hope, of potential. Right now, I'm waiting for my bedroom alarm clock to go off and wake me up out of this dream. I don't think anything good has happened to me all year, so this has to be a trick. At any moment, I know I'm going to wake up. I just know it. Hey, don't get ketchup on it. I thought you didn't like this stuff anyway, saying it's all nasty and stuff, I exclaimed to him as he reads, chomping on a stolen French fry. Chill, I see the ketchup. I'm entitled to one French fry. I'm hungry too, and all they had here were iceberg lettuce salad for us healthy vegetarians to eat. Food style, don't ruin it, hypocrite, I say. You need to calm down, it's fine. Hey, look, you get to stay in a one-bedroom apartment single at Columbia. I'm totally visiting. Wow, a free Metro card. They're even giving you a really generous stipend. All you have to do is basically pay for meals. Wait, you have a dining pass for 21 meals per week in the university's dining hall. This is so awesome. And I'll be in New York like every other weekend too. I should give you like the addresses of some of my friends there. And then Savannah interrupts him. I haven't thought about it yet, Eric. This research assistantship is a lot of time away from home. I have to think about it, he says. What do you mean you have to think about it? Rogards just offered you a chance to work in New York City with free room and board and a stipend. Do you know how prestigious it is to be the research assistant to a McEnroe Fellow at Columbia University? Number one, this fellowship is usually given to a professor at a well-known four-year liberal arts college, not a community college like Stonehill. And Savannah interrupts him. Well, not everyone can go to Harvard, snob, and we're ranked in the top 50 best two-year colleges in the country, I spout, opening up my box of chicken McNuggets. I can't believe you eat like that. You're so skinny. What do your arteries look like? Eric asks. Eat like what? It's all white meat. It's healthy. He rolls his eyes. Certainly not healthy for the chickens that had to die for it. I'm surprised you don't care about that since you're all into social justice and stuff. I simply sigh in annoyance and then roll my eyes, choosing to ignore his assessment of my meal. He continues. You're a teenager, so I know I'm not going to convince you that you can't live off of soda, Dunkin' Donuts, and McDonald's for the rest of your life. It's taxing on the immune system. I roll my eyes again. End quote. So, I'm going to go back to this concept of the food objects that represent white neoliberal civility. And kind of going back to the work I had done analyzing PETA for my dissertation work and the vegan objects that they promoted as cruelty-free, which were foods you can buy, but the companies are notorious for human rights violations, especially use of systemic racism to exploit the labor of non-white laborers. So, what's going on with this McDonald's? So let's go back to Eric's use and his plethora of PETA paraphernalia. And the fact that you'll notice in the book later that he is a Whole Foods shopper. And he's always making fun of the fact that Savannah eats at McDonald's. And this is quite telling and provides a culinary guide to what food objects are important to symbolize a certain type of white person. The Neoliberal White. And there's this book by Mark Lombardo. He's the author of Economies of Whiteness, on the social ecology of white liberals. And he writes throughout his book how particular food objects amongst neoliberal whites convey that they are a different type of white. They're not the poor, quote-unquote, redneck white, and they're certainly not the wealthy, elite, Republican white. They are the liberal, I'm not racist whites who voted Obama into office, who helped to support Bill Clinton's policies, such as NAFTA, and the 1996 Well-Formed Reform Act that had very racist and racialized consequences that many white liberals didn't foresee or didn't want to foresee. So it's obvious that PETA and Eric's veganism come from a post-racial center. And I did this on purpose to echo the dissertation work I had done on vegan, cruelty-free shopping guides and analysis of PETA founder Ingrid Newkirk's post-racial vegan logic. So similar to Newkirk, Eric's critique of Savannah's food choices is very post-racial and makes assumptions about socioeconomic class and food access. Having grown up white and class privileged, Eric never had to think about the ways in which socioeconomic class and being racialized as non-white shape the food tastes of people like Savannah. It would never occur to him that for Savannah, McDonald's is a cheap refuge that does taste great to her. The days in which someone has called her a nigger or she is panicking about how she will be able to finish school, work 40 hours a week, and pay for their heating and electric bill. It is the logic of neoliberal whiteness as center in Eric's world that allows him to be privileged enough to not even ever have to know how deeply embedded surviving racism, sexism, and poverty are in the food choices for someone like Savannah. It is deeply problematic for him to imply that Savannah's praxis of social justice is immature when he says, you know, I can't believe you would eat like this, I thought you were into social justice. Because she isn't questioning the lives of chickens raised for her meal when he has no clue about how she's using McDonald's to deal with this continuum of racism, classism, and sexism. Eric suggests he is worried about her immune system because she's eating at a fast food joint. However, he never speaks about how systemic racism and neoliberal whiteness are systemically taxing on the physical, emotional, and community health of so many Black people with Savannah's experience. Eric deeply believes that his observations are objectively ethical, when in fact they come from the subjective and privileged perspective of a white, upper middle class, cisgendered man. And I want to explore this relationship of what I consider white man-splaining, with not just Eric, but also Savannah's close friend Davis, and in reference to the meaning of the food object cow dairy in Davis and Savannah's lives. So I'm going to read from an excerpt again. And first of all, Davis, to refresh your memory, is the friend that Savannah grew up with in their small town of 5,000 people called East Lebanon. And it's 99% white. And by the way, it's based on the town I actually grew up in, which is called Lebanon. And my parents decided to move my family to the 99% rural white town in 1978. And I was almost 2. And a lot of my book is kind of based on that experience of being a Black person being raised in rural white, like dairy town. In a fairly, not really conservative, but definitely people who were very direct about me not belonging there and, you know, calling me nigger the first day of 7th grade, which I actually have that in the intro of the book. So here's the dialogue between Davis and Davis and Savannah. And Davis also is deaf, so Savannah learned how to sign at an early age. Esperanza and I had lunch today, Davis tells me as I take a bite out of my apple. We are sitting in Violet's cafe at our usual table at the usual evening time.
We drove around forever to find a restaurant that serves vegan food and fair trade teas and coffee, he says. Why the hell is she a vegan now? I roll my eyes, remembering how, 2 years ago, she had decided to turn into a vegetarian and drove her mama crazy. She had been given a PETA pamphlet by some crazy white protester at a KFC in Willimantic. She and I had been walking by it to get to the fabric store. The short and fat white lady was screaming, "Animals are the new slaves!" I told Esperanza not to take the pamphlet, but she did anyway. For 2 weeks straight, she would not stop telling me how cows are enslaved, just like black people. There was even one point in which she threatened to end our friendship if I didn't stop eating chicken McNuggets. I literally told her, "Kiss my black ass." She didn't talk to me for 2 weeks. So here's going back to Savannah and Davis talking. It's her new thing. I mean, I get that her dad was murdered because of coffee and cocoa, but now she wants to stop drinking milk and eating eggs because she says it's all the same thing. I told her that she didn't know what she was talking about and that all our cows are treated really well and humanely. That's Davis. Oh Lord, I'm not interested in going through this crap with her again, I say. I don't know, maybe it won't be as bad as it was last time. We found a place called Veg Planet, and all I was allowed to eat was a fermented tofu burger called Tiki or Temple, or something weird on gluten-free bread. I don't get it. Whatever, I guess it's her new thing. Her new thing? Yeah, some new natural diet based on compassionate consumption. We had some nasty brownie, he air quotes the brownie, made from rice milk and carob and some other nasty crap. Her face looks really cleared up from the acne, though, and she claims it's the vegan way. He emphasizes his pronunciation of vegan way as if it's some esoteric, mysterious path to enlightenment. I giggle. I remember when Mama tried to convince me that carob was just as good as chocolate, I say, shaking my head as I try to get the memory of that blasphemous taste out of my mind. When she realized that I was lactose intolerant, some lady at school found out. She gave Mama some carob and soy powder and promised her that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and chocolate milk. Did it work? Hell no. She ended up mixing Hershey's cocoa and Domino's sugar to get me to drink soy milk during my childhood. She thought it was cheaper to make it from powder than to buy packaged soy chocolate milk at the store. End quote. So here's my analysis of what I was trying to convey to the audience. So Davis tells Esperanza, so Esperanza and Davis had met at Veg Planet, and Esperanza had said, cows are treated badly. They're just treated badly. Davis tells Esperanza that she doesn't know what she's talking about, but he also, throughout the book, tells Savannah that she doesn't know what she is talking about in terms of racism. Savannah speaks about lactose intolerance as well. So let's kind of look at this food object of cow milk, dairy, the dairy industry. Cow milk's normalcy represents white supremacy as well as speciesism and how humans can determine what is humane for a non-human animal. Can you hear me? Okay. Let me read that again. Cow milk's normalcy represents white supremacy as well as speciesism and how humans can determine what is humane for a non-human animal. Just like white people like Davis can determine what is racist and angry black female militant banter. What Esperanza says is uncomfortable for Savannah, but maybe too close to home. Both black human slaves and cows' reproductive systems were and are colonized and exploited to feed certain human beings. And I wanted Esperanza's intervention into this whole cow dairy thing. And I wanted the audience to understand that Esperanza is alluding to how black female slaves' children were taken away from them while they were still expected to lactate and nurse white slave masters' babies. Similarly, the only way that dairy cows can produce milk for humans is to be constantly impregnated and then their babies taken away immediately from the grieving cow mom. So with this scene about cow dairy, about Savannah and Davis having a conversation about what Davis and Esperanza had talked about, My intention was to have dairy as a food object become a symbol of interlocking oppression that narrates multiple histories of racialized and specious oppression of people and non-human animals as, quote-unquote, commodities within a white supremacist capitalist logic. Savannah's cultural foods, if you think about it, are not cow dairy, along with 85% of the black population of the USA who are severely lactose intolerant. And Savannah is, she comes from ancestry from people who were brought over from Africa to the south of America and mixing with Seminole, which is my mother's history, and I integrated that. 85% of the black population of the USA are severely lactose intolerant, and I'm one of them. What has occurred, in which her cultural foods were replaced with the expectation that she can drink readily available cow dairy, once again in a nation in which 85% of black people are lactose intolerant. I believe for Asian Americans it's like 90%. How did the institution of antebellum slavery and the industrialization of the food system through Euro-Anglo-centric racist and capitalist logic create a dietary situation in which Savannah found herself drinking cow milk and then finding out that she's lactose intolerant? How has white capitalist racist logic even created a situation in which black women and girls are consumable and commodifiable, starting with antebellum slavery? How is it that this situation created this configuration created a situation that they experience the world as being the white world sees them as the consumable other, usually by a white cisgender male gaze. And to explore these questions about black women's bodies as consumable, I want to read another excerpt from the book. And I'm trying to use, let me just go back to that. I'm trying to use this symbol of dairy to kind of connect this history of exploiting both cows' reproductive systems and also the exploitation of black women's bodies to build a white nation of America. So they're consumable commodities. And before I read the next excerpt, I want to remind the audience that Savannah lives in East Lebanon, which is 99% white, and it's a big cow and chicken farming town, working class, and about 5,000 people. Savannah works many hours a week at a local convenience store where she often doesn't feel safe due to racist and sexist verbal assaults. The scene I will read below is her working at a convenience store. And in this scene, her friend Davis had just left, and he says he'll come back and drive her to community college. So it's just her and this other guy in the store. I noticed that the 50-something-year-old white man wearing a Red Sox baseball cap who entered the store 20 minutes ago is still here. He's on the other side, perusing the magazines on the cold metal display racks. Though I've never seen him before, I immediately feel that I do not like him. Finally, he chooses a magazine, turns around, licks and sucks his lips quietly, grins, then slowly approaches the register. As he drifts toward me, new Converse sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, I feel what can only be described as a chill of fear seizing my brown skin. Before he can get to the register, my arms command me to hide my body in my V-sized breasts. As fast as I can, I'm grabbing my winter coat, zipping it up to my neck. He arrives at the counter. In his left hand is the porn magazine, Whoa, Man. Methodically, he looks at the magazine, looks at me, looks down at the magazine again, then ultimately places it onto the countertop and then slides it towards me. A slimy grin on his chalky face. Instantaneously, the comforting scent of Davis has died and is replaced by the redolence of a sweating beast. Slowly creeping from the bottom of my hungry stomach, I am overwhelmed with the sensation of being like a fox that has been cornered by hounds, by white men on their stately white horses on some plantation from the 1700s. You didn't have to do that, he starts, his conniving grin refusing to leave his face. I respond with crumpled eyebrows and a shaky customer-friendly half-smile. I'm sorry, what? And there's the internal monologue. Just pay and leave. Just freaking pay and leave. I quickly scan the store and realize that he and I are the only ones present. Why does Kidder sell this garbage here? It just attracts the freaky Chester the molester types. A pretty little thing like yourself shouldn't hide under that winter coat, he continues. Fervently, I ignore the comment, then ask him, is that it? And avoid looking at the picture on the cover of Woman. Foxy ladies, huh? He says, pointing to the cover. I refuse to look and then repeat with a nervous, customer-friendly smile, is this it? I place my left hand on top of the magazine, hiding the cover woman's face and torso. I take the scanner from the register and move my small hand that is on top of the magazine slightly to the right. I scan the barcode while not allowing my eyes to gaze at what his eyes have been visually consuming. As the picture of the cover girl's legs dangle beneath my hand, I notice that they are brown, nearly the same tone as mine. I have seen the cover women on these magazines when restocking the display shelves every month. It is rare that I see brown or black legs grace its cover. Below her legs is the title, The Blacker the Berry. So East Lebanon doesn't have no exotic ladies like that, so I don't know if it's true. That'll be $8, I respond, refusing to make eye contact with him. And he says, that's pretty expensive. These ladies always are. With my peripheral vision, I see him reaching to his back pocket for his money. But I can't say I wouldn't pay a lot more for the real thing, he says with an insidious cackle, pretending that he is half-heartedly joking. $8, huh? That's probably more than they give you people per hour here, huh? That's a shame. Pretty little thing like yourself deserves more. Then puts a crisp $50 bill on the side of the magazine. Sorry, sweetie. I just cashed my check and I always ask for it in 50s. This isn't too big for you, is it? Nope, I quickly reply, grabbing the 50, then punching the amount into the register with my furious and scared fingers. I try to place his change back onto the spot where he had left the bill for me to take. My attempt not to be touched by him fails. His pudgy, fish-belly white hands quickly grasp and slide the money out of my hand. In measurement of time, I know it's quick and brief action, but it is a short moment that feels and lasts longer than I want it to. I feel warm sweat and aggressive firmness as his calloused hands intentionally graze the top and bottom of my frigid hand. So there's a scene which it's hard to understand, but the next scene, she's in the bathroom. The pit of my stomach twists and burns as I vomit into the employee toilet bathroom. I cannot stop visualizing Scott on top of my mother, tearing into her. As I retch again, the searing face of Scott mutates into him, and my mother's agonizing face turns into mine. And she's recalling her memories about this man named Scott, where she knows there's this arrangement her mother made so she could pay for an apartment. And now she's thinking about how this is trickling down that women are still, sexualized, objectified, especially if they're women of color. So she's thinking, 2007, and they still sell trash like that. Blacker the berry? Blacker the berry? I vomit the last bits of anger from my body, then pull myself up by the edge of the still sink. Immediately, I turn the hot water on, pump a large amount of antibacterial soap onto my hand, and then furiously start washing the hand he had touched. A cracked mirror hangs in front of me, but I cannot look at it. I cannot look at myself right now. The scalding water burns, helping to move the anguish from those burning images of Scott and Mama in my head onto my hands. The nerves underneath my brown smoothness of my skin scream to my brain to be relieved, but I do not remove it. My mind screams back in retaliation. Why did you let him touch you? Why did you let him touch your hand? Why did you let him get away with that? End quote. So, what was I trying to do with this scene? The woman on the cover of the magazine is there to be consumed. And there's this popular phrase, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but basically it's this pornographic construction of women as sex objects, and that, yeah, blondes are fun, but the other black and brown women are even more fun because they're so exotic, and white women are so reserved in terms of sex and sexuality, but black women, they are not sexually reserved. And there's, a lot of work been done by bell hooks that really talks about
the white male gaze and black women as the other to be consumed. And it's usually to be consumed by the white heteronormative cisgender man's gaze. So I try to tie this into the importance of thinking about commodification of black women's bodies, reproductive exploitation, cows, and intersectional approach to the matrix of oppression. Savannah feels horrible about how her breasts have been constructed, not for the purpose to feed a baby she may give birth to, but that they are solely there for this white man as a sexual object in which he has no say in the matter. So, in the store, when she sees that guy coming, she's always been self-conscious of having the size D breast. So she zips up. So I'm not comparing cow dairy and black women's bodily exploitation as the same. I don't do comparisons. But what I'm suggesting is how black women's bodies and the bodies of cows have been organized through the logic of white supremacist capitalist specious patriarchy ordering of the USA over the past 400 years tells us more about why Savannah feels the way she does, why cow dairy is normalized to the point where Savannah thinks it's normal to drink it and that she thinks she's lactose intolerant, and not really questioning the mere fact that most of the world doesn't eat cow dairy and that they can't handle it. So why is this a disorder when a minority the whites can actually eat it, and up to a certain age, because most white people become lactose intolerant as well as they get older because they lose the enzyme to digest. So, cow and black women's body exploitation is not the same thing, but they're part of this same machinery of whiteness. They're, two gears of many within this machinery. The breasts of black girls and women and the udders of cows, which are breasts, symbolize how racist and specious oppression exploitation of reproductive systems built the white wealth of the USA and still undergird the continued logic of why it's okay to collectively treat black women and girls and treat cows as dairy producers, cows as dairy producers as mere commodities, or a means to an end that maintains and upholds white supremacist specious ordering of the USA. And the character Esperanza, she knows and understands this about food objects, race, and speciesism in a way that both Eric, who is vegan, and Savannah, who isn't, both of them don't really understand that. So Esperanza she's the intervention. So, when she makes these comments about dairy, as well as other commodities, she's really bringing in that perspective that both Eric and Savannah need to understand, and how both, Eric and Savannah suffer in this system of neoliberal whiteness in different ways. So, Eric, as a white person, he's trained to not understand whiteness and the food commodity chain, and how racism makes it possible for him to have access in a way that Savannah doesn't. And Savannah hasn't really been trained to think critically about the place of non-human animals and how, these gears of oppression, racism, speciesism, the exploitation of black women's bodies, how that's all part of this machinery of whiteness since the onset of antebellum slavery. And I also talk a lot about cocoa in this book, and really understanding, once again, this concept of exploited labor and acknowledging, say you have a cocoa product and it's vegan, as long as a non-human animal was not harmed, a lot of the mainstream vegan world, they don't care. They don't seem to care, even when you mention that a child has been enslaved on the Ivory Coast to harvest it. And the Food Empowerment Project, Laura Arnellis has done extensive work going out and trying to explain that to largely white vegans and not having a lot of support. Like, why should I care? Why do I care that a child is enslaved? That really gets people thinking about who is worth compassion and who isn't, and why isn't there compassion for both the cow dairy cow and the child that is enslaved to pick the vegan cocoa. So here's a scene that I want to read from the book, and we're talking about cocoa here. And they're in New York City, and they're at a club. It's Esperanza, Savannah, and Eric. And it's Savannah's first trip to the village. And she's at a club where it's a drag club.
And she's a little nervous, so a lot of her transphobia starts surfacing. Or not, her not really acknowledging it is transphobia, but very uncomfortable. But they're all sitting at this table and they're having beverages. So she looks around. It's not very crowded, I noticed. About 10 other patrons are scattered around the floor. And the waitress says to her, "We don't open for another 15 minutes, but y'all know Chinois, and he's super special because he's best friends with Cesar. Drinks?" "So, what do you think so far?" Troy asks, and that's another character. And for some reason, Eric is sitting there sipping a chocolate martini, a vegan chocolate martini that costs a lot of money. I roll my eyes. "A $15 martini, Eric?" "Well, I offered you one since it was above your budget, but you said no," he says to me. "It's not because it's above my budget. I said I didn't want one because that's obnoxious," I say. He decides to ignore me and then repeats the question to Esperanza. "So, what do you think?" And Esperanza responds, "Obnoxious isn't really the word I'd use as much as oblivious to how many people have probably died to get that chocolate into your glass." Eric shakes his head. "Huh? No, I mean, what do you think of the club so far?" "Oh, you meant that," she says, shaking her head, pretending it was an innocent miscommunication. "I'm so loving it." And then there's a few scenes later where the chocolate martini thing comes up and Coco comes up again after they've left the club and they're gonna go and look at the play Annie. And then Savannah's just got off the phone with her mother and she knows her mother has emphysema and she knows her mother just admitted that she's snuck in a cigarette and it's just driving her mother crazy. I mean, driving Savannah crazy. And she gets upset with Eric because he says something and he's like, "Why are you always yelling at me and mean to me?" And she says, "Sorry, I just get upset whenever I talk to my mother, okay? And she's smoking and she knows she shouldn't be doing that. I hear her fading away from me and it pisses me off." "I know, sweetie, I know," Esperanza says. And Eric says, "If you know this happens, then why don't you try to find another way to deal with it? Talk about the way you're feeling with your friends instead of barking at us," Eric suggests, rubbing my nose and letting out a sigh. "Because you do and say things that piss me off, Eric. It's not just me. Like that martini nonsense. You have no idea why it was even hurtful to me and even more to Esperanza." She interrupts. "It's okay, Savi. The coffee and chocolate talk can be the next lesson. There was a time when you didn't know either," she whispers. How can she be so calm about everything he says and does? Okay, so there was a time before I met Esperanza, I didn't know that people are still dying and enslaved for my Nestle Crunch or Hershey's bar. She's right, I reluctantly think to myself. Then Eric says, "Chocolate lesson? Do people of color who are brown and black call themselves chocolate and coffee?" Eric asks, confused. And Savannah thinks, "I probably gave her the same look too during her first November in America when I offered to share that Hershey's chocolate bar with her during lunch, and she responded by crying about her father. Her father had been killed because he was the organizer in Guatemala for coffee and cocoa growers." And then Savannah thinks, "Man, this is so hard. I know I'm not like him. I am not that oblivious." End quote. So it's back to, Esperanza kind of being this point for both of Eric and Savannah to really question their relationships to not just food objects, but their agency with, or lack thereof, within this system of racism and speciesism, and exploiting, people, such as children who are literally abducted to work on cocoa plantations. She's there to really question that, to move them to the next step. And she's doing it in a way that is more based in compassion, and she doesn't get as angry as Savannah does, and I think it's rightfully so that she should get angry, but Savannah comes from a different point than Esperanza. I think a lot of Esperanza just growing up in Guatemala and being part of, seeing how cocoa and coffee growers are suffering and seeing what the work her parents were doing. It's very different than what Savannah has grown up with in America, and feeling kind of like she's had no agency. She's never even really organized the way that Esperanza's family was able to do, even if it meant that her father was murdered by people who didn't like that he was organizing the growers.
I wonder if we might break soon for questions.
Yeah, how long should the questions be?
Maybe 10 minutes. Or so.
Okay, yeah, I'm almost done, so that's good. So there's a sense where
she's really, really just frustrated because she's like, I'm not like him. I'm not oblivious like him. So there's this like realization where, all this time I've been thinking how I am surviving through racism. I'm always thinking about racism, and it's almost too much to think about, wow, I'm actually contributing to suffering. I didn't know that, and it's hard for anyone to be approached that way. And a response all the time when Savannah is approached by Esperanza about veganism, or like, why are you drinking Coca-Cola? My people die when people drink Coca-Cola, and my people are dying when you're drinking coffee. She's uncomfortable with that reality, in a way that Eric is also uncomfortable when it's pointed out that the food objects he has easy access to, is because of his oblivion around white privilege. So they're both like, I'm not like each other, and when in fact they represent what happens to both the colonized, the descendants of the colonized and the colonizer in this configuration of neoliberal whiteness. So they both lose out. They're both ignorant. Ignorance perpetuates more suffering, but the consequences are different. They're racialized in class, and you see that with the relationship. Sorry, my baby's crying. Of course, I'm distracted. With the relationship that Savannah has to food objects versus the relationship that Eric has to food objects, but you still see that there's still something mixing in their social justice praxis. And it's Esperanza who's there to kind of help them move along together and really, really understand that they can be together in this struggle against oppression and systemic injustice. But it's just going to look different, and there's going to be different ways of approaching that depending on your racial and class experience. So I want to just read the conclusion. One second. So Esperanza's character engages in veganism from a critical race perspective, particularly when she tries to make connections to cow dairy and the exploited reproductive gifts of black women during antebellum slavery. And we see Savannah finally open up to veganism when Esperanza teaches her that Cesar Chavez was vegan because he saw the same intersectional oppression occurring with Latino immigrant farm workers and the treatment of farm animals as part of the kyriarchy. That is, understanding that racism, sexism, xenophobia, and speciesism, as well as other isms, are part of a matrix of domination and oppression. While Eric comes off as thinking of himself as civilized by drinking a vegan chocolate martini, Savannah struggles with not being interpreted, like I said, as the same as Eric, in terms of oblivion to oppression in food objects. And it's Savannah's side of struggle with these food objects that shows the damage that neoliberal whiteness and globalized capitalism have on the mental and physical health and communities of racial minorities such as Black Americans in the USA. And Esperanza's relationship with food objects and her decolonial approach intervened for both Eric and Savannah to produce better ways of thinking about ethics, race, whiteness, and the food commodity chain. So if you're interested in more of how food objects, veganism, and critical race materialism are recipes for racial tension headaches, I often say, I invite you to check out my work. And I have my most recent online conference that happened 3 weeks ago was called The Vegan Praxis of Black Lives Matter. And the questions we asked basically were, what does ethical consumption look like in an era of Ferguson? Can it be a continuum of the Black Lives Matter movement and resist neoliberal whiteness and systemic racism? What would it look like if we made visible to mainstream vegan USA that the murders of Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Michael Brown, Oscar Grant, and Eric Garner, to name a few, are the collateral damages of neoliberal whiteness? And here's information about my work. And this is what you can find, and that's my baby. And I'm not sure if that's okay. I mean, I don't know how people find this. I feel about me answering questions while nursing her. Okay, because I do that a lot. So thank you very much. If you have questions, yeah, I'm totally nursing. That's okay. Yeah, sure.
Should we take this off?
Yeah. Oh, I can stand. I'm so used to walking while nursing, taking care of my 3 and 6 year olds. Okay. That's great. I'll stand for now. Well, thank you everyone for coming to listen to me share. This is I'm like a new book, so I'm still kind of working on presenting and how I'm digging into the food object aspect of the book. There's a lot going on in the book. The book can be used for so many different things, but I took time to actually focus on how I'm using food objects in this novel. But like, it can be used for gender studies, sexuality studies, Black studies, like all these different things. I just focused on cultural food studies. So ask away, comment away.
What do you think
Yes?
of the use of food stamps for healthier foods, such as vegan foods, and maybe poorer areas, as far as voting with the dollar? So maybe they wouldn't be able to buy expensive vegan foods, but using it in a more conscious way. Like,
Well, I think for me,
there's a huge budget for that in this country. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean,
a lot of it could be spent on just like, not cigarettes and alcohol, but pretty much, if people want to spend it on like ice cream and whatever, like junk food, like, Pepsi Cola versus.
Well, I think that's a good question, because there's a debate about, is that the right thing to do or not? And I think the problem is when the government still decides what to do with a population they screwed over. And then within this logic, without even asking the community what they need, they do things like food stamps, and you can only buy certain foods or things with it. So I think the question has to kind of be reworked, where I think there's a lot of money spent on that, where like one of the problems is like there was a huge loss of land and food sovereignty or security with this population, and that there's a lot of people where I think there's this mainstream misconception that like Black people they only have food stamps, they don't know what to do with them, blah blah blah. When there's so many Black communities that know they need the land to produce their own food and their own cultural foods, and that whole history of colonialism, and then the great Black migration to the north when Jim Crow happened. Nobody really wanted to be there, so they left the South where they were agrarian lifestyle, raising their own food. They all knew what to do and how to do and how to eat healthy. Then moving north to the industrialized cities, losing that land, and then going to a situation where they were exploited in a way they didn't realize would be, the consequence of leaving Jim Crow, and losing land, and losing access to land and growing, and those cultural foodways. I'm giving you, because I always have to provide a lot of context when I answer current questions. And I think the government really needs to revisit the whole, 40 acres and a mule, without the mule, of course, because I'm vegan, but the whole nature of, once again, it's neoliberal logic, let's give them food stamps and they can buy food from companies that exploit labor and usually animals as well. To, what can it look like where we configure everything and start looking at, is it possible to end environmental racism, to end land grabbing, which is benefiting mostly white upper class, at least in this area in California, Silicon Valley people. What can we do about that instead of the food stamp issue? So I think it goes back to what the Black Panthers have been doing 40 years ago, where they pissed off the government, because you know what? The government was really concerned that the Black Panthers were focused on food sovereignty and security. That was what scared the government. They realized if people can get back to actually growing their own food and feeding themselves, that's dangerous. So how can we kind of perpetuate the system of relying on the government and white supremacy through this whole notion of food stamps? That's my answer, is that the problem is it's trying to help the people you screwed over through your own logic that really is helping them survive versus dismantling a system that wasn't created to help them from the beginning. So that's my answer.
Do you see much urban gardens in the Bay Area where you are?
Yeah, Oakland is another thing. When you look at mainstream news, all they talk about is how evil Oakland is, and it's scary. I think the most amazing food justice work is coming out of Oakland. And it's from brown and Black communities of mostly of color, lower income, who understand that. And that's where the Black Panther Party started. It's huge there. The work that they're doing, not relying on things like food stamps or maybe we'll move a Walmart to a community, but literally alternative ways of eating food. And a lot of it going back to cultural food ways and really understanding reclaiming lots of land, and even if the land has been decimated because of environmental racism, where there's so much pollution there, let's do raised beds and grow on food. And I see that happening like crazy there, but also there's a huge problem where a lot of them have to fight to keep that land because quote unquote they don't own it. So there's the African town which has been fighting for months because I guess the landlord never used this empty space, and then the community went and started growing the food and like nourishing themselves. And then the landlord comes and is like, you can't do this. we can't use it, we want to do something else with it, and they've been fighting just to have that lot to feed their community. So here they are doing that work, food sovereignty, security, and they're punished. They're punished instead. Let's take it away. And of course, the results will be we have to rely probably on food stamps or some other government's assistance program. Versus what you really need to do is revisit the 40 acres, thing. I don't know if people know that, but when Black people were free, they're like, now we want our 40 acres. You need that land to be self-sufficient. So I see that happening in Oakland, and there's many places, unless you're there or you have alternative media sources to see what's actually going. The mainstream media really makes you think that brown and Black people cannot support themselves in terms of food and health, and that they need food stamps and other assistance through like white supremacist ways of what they think food and security are. So Oakland, check out Oakland, it's amazing. So to answer your question, anything else? Yes?
I have a question. I work at a university in Colorado, and in the staff for student development areas, there was a lot of focus on unpacking the privilege knapsack would be the, that's how they would use it for the staff. But then when I would say things about speciesism, and but other people didn't want to hear that, and I don't know if you can speak to that at all. Like I would overhear people saying, oh, I mean, these are women and men, but mostly women, who would say, who were very passionate about ending oppression, but then, and making a welcoming environment for all students, but then say things like, I love bacon.
Well, I wasn't there, so